So, hello everybody, and today I would like us to continue our work together on George Eliot's Middlemarch, and I want us to consider the notion of money in Middlemarch. This would be a possible leçon for you, or indeed it could also have been an essay subject for you to deal with. So to begin with, I'm going to quote the literary critic Lionel Trilling, who claimed that the novel is born with the appearance of money as a social element. You'll find that quotation numbered 1 on the handout of quotations that I have sent you called Money in Middlemarch Quotations. And you'll see I have footnoted my debt to my colleague Marie-Laure Massey-Chamaillou, who wrote a chapter on the subject of money in Middlemarch, an excellent chapter, which appeared in the volume edited by Jean-Charles Perquin, published by Ellipse in 2019. And again, I'm very grateful to her for sharing that chapter with me and for the points that I have derived from it. So the novel is born with the appearance of money as a social element. Indeed, we can date the birth of the novel to the mid-18th century, when there was a growing circulation of literature, which became a commodity at that time. Publishing was a business, or became a business, and George Eliot herself could function as an independent woman, earning her own money, and writing for her was a business proposition. Her partner, George Lewis, indeed negotiated her publishing contracts with the publisher Blackwood, and we know that the novel Middlemarch was a commercial success for her. She set the novel at a time of change in the Victorian period, as you know, on the eve of the first Reform Bill, which itself was linked to money, because it gave the vote to all householders who were defined as those who paid a yearly rent of £10 or more. So there was a financial definition of the franchise. At the time of her novel, both when it takes place and when it was written, of course, gender relations were an issue, and several property acts were passed in the course of the 19th century. It's important to remember that married women were dispossessed of their property. It was their husbands who were the legal owners of the money that they earned or inherited. However, a widow could own her own property, and that, of course, is important in our study of Middlemarch. During the period Middlemarch was set, the monetary system was also undergoing change, which Eliot points to in the quotation, the second quotation I gave you from page 88, when she writes, "The old stocking gave way to savings banks, and the worship of the solar guinea, which was a kind of gold coin, became extinct." So we have a different type of monetary system with the setup of the savings bank. And the fact that the coin, the gold coin, the symbol of money, which was represented as a valuable metal, was no longer worshipped, was no longer sanctified. So the questions posed here are, how does money operate in what Eliot calls this home epic? You'll remember that comes from the beginning of the last chapter. How does it contribute to distinguishing the players active in this study of provincial life? In other words, how do they stand in relation to money? More generally, what is the function of money in what I could call the literary economy of Eliot's novel? And we must remember that the word economy was initially meant the manager of a household, the one who managed its expenditure. And we have that use of economy as managing a household or a domestic sphere. In the first instance of the word in our novel on page 7, where there's reference to the well-bred economy of the domestic sphere. It was only later that the word economy became used to mean finances more generally, and our current use of the word economy. So to answer the questions raised, I have outlined 3 parts. The first one is how money stamps the characters in the study of provincial life, and I'm using the verb stamp there, borrowed from its use to stamp a coin, meaning to emboss it with the value it has. But of course, to stamp someone's character also means to highlight their qualities. So how are they marked by money? The second part is how money motivates, how it is a dynamic force. Money is a currency in this novel, which circulates between the characters almost with the power of an electric current galvanizing their action. And then thirdly, I would like us to look at the language of money, money as a representational system, which has a symbolic value, and we can talk about the semiotics of the financial network in our novel. So to begin with, how does money stamp characters in this portrait gallery of the community members? Well, of course, money is a determinant in social status, and one can define the character's position in society according to their income, and of course in the concrete expression of where they live, the houses that they own. So money takes on a visible manifestation in land and in property. We can begin at the top of the scale with Sir James Chetham, whose wealth is embodied in his estate at Freshitt. He himself embodies the land-owning aristocracy, whose power rested on land, on rents, on social rank, political influence, and of course the prestige of a title. On the lower end of the social spectrum, we have the Dagleys, who are called on page 369 pauper laborers, and they live in a place ironically named Freeman's End. They are, of course, tenants of Mr. Brooke, who proves to be rather mean in his management of the lands, and that meanness will affect his reputation when he puts himself forward on the political scene as a candidate for Parliament, and he wanted to be a reform candidate. The middle ground between the aristocracy and the tenant farmers is occupied by the Garth family. Mr. Garth, Caleb Garth, who is indifferent to money, and he has no notion of what capital means or how it functions, as we're told, and this is the 4th quotation I've given you, that he could not manage finance. He knew values well enough, but he had no keenness of imagination for monetary results in the shape of profit and loss. And that note that the narrator there points out that he couldn't manage finance, but he did know value, making a distinction between monetary value and values more generally, human values, we could say, the values of labor and other such non-monetary values. Caleb is said to have an unconquerable indifference to money, which of course contrasts with the other members, some of the other members of the community, whom we will get to know. So property is one indicator of wealth and a relationship to money. Another is, of course, whether or not the characters are wage earners. Wage earning functions as a social divide. The Garths are wage earners. We know that Mary Garth is a housekeeper and a school teacher. Her mother her mother was also a woman described by Mrs. Vinci as a woman who had had to work for her bread, and we see her in the kitchen, as it were, doing two jobs at once, multitasking, we would say, cooking, but also teaching the local children. So the Garths are wage earners. In contrast to someone like Mr. Featherstone, and here we come to character types derived from the comedy of manners. The character types related to money. We could say that Mr. Featherstone is like a miser. However, he's a more complex character than that, and the narrator is at pains to define him as not a harpagon, whose passions had all been devoured by the ever lean and ever hungry passion of saving, though quickly adding that he did love money. He has a traditional approach to money, advising on page 103, advising Fred Vinci to invest in land and not to engage in speculation. That contrasts, of course, with Mr. Bulstrode, the banker, and the banker figure is another figure that we find in the comedy of manners. But Bulstrode is not just an honest banker. On the contrary, he is a dishonest banker, a swindler. He is also a hypocrite who identifies his financial success as a sign of divine election. He thinks that God has made him one of the promised by ensuring his financial success. And the fact that he has earned money, which he then, of course, invests in the town of Middlemarch, is the result of his dishonest engagement in pawnbroking, as a pawnbroker in his younger days, and he tries to compensate for that. He tries to redeem himself through philanthropy. And that word to redeem, that verb, is important because it's the verb that is used when you go back to the pawnbrokers to recover what you have lent. You want to redeem your possessions. But of course, it's also a religious word, that of redemption, and we have a kind of financial parable of being redeemed, of being bought back. So the religious and the financial discourses are not separated, as you will see in a passage that we studied earlier on page 580. On page 581, Bulstrode as a pawnbroker redeeming himself later in life. Another character who is portrayed in relation to money, very briefly but significantly, is Edward Casaubon, described, and this is the 10th quotation, as a man of enough wealth, or wealth enough, to give luster to his piety. And that's an ironic description of him. If there's any character in this novel who lacks luster, brilliance, and shininess, it is, of course, Mr. Casaubon, associated with dark labyrinths and dimly lit libraries. And faith is not what marks him either. His faith is far from shining, but indeed he does have some wealth, as we are told. Wealth, as I said in the introduction, is linked to gender status as well, and therefore to women. We can see on the one hand Rosamond Vinci, the product of Mrs. Lemon's school, where she has learned how to behave like a lady, and notably how to get in and out of a carriage. In other words, how to negotiate her wealth, how to behave towards her wealth. We are told in the 11th quotation I've given you that she she was rather frivolous in her attitude to wealth, we can say she did not respond uh, responsibly to the wealth that she had hoped to have. The narrator writes, there was nothing financial, still less sordid, in her provisions. She cared about what were considered refinements and not about the money that was to pay for them. So she wasn't concerned with how she was going to pay for for the indulgences that she dreamt of her. She has a certain ignorance about money, which is self-centered, as you can see in the next quote. She had no wicked plots. She never thought of money except as something necessary with which other people would always provide. So other people would provide for her. She didn't need to concern herself with money. Now, this ignorance about money becomes blamable. She does have her part of responsibility in the bankruptcy of her marriage, because she showed no discrimination concerning costs or concerning the monetary value of what she was purchasing or what she was requiring. It's the carriage, which she learnt to get in and out of with grace, which Mr. Brooke evokes when he considers the prospect of Dorothea renouncing her wealth at the end of the novel and living only on £700 a year. And he says on page 766 that he couldn't imagine Dorothea living without a carriage, as if the carriage were a kind of symbol of wealth and the circulation of wealth. Dorothea is indeed associated with wealth right from the opening passages of the novel. She has a scheme, a philanthropic scheme, to build cottages to better the housing of the laborers on the estate. And the initial portrait of her opens looking forward to the time, this is a quotation from page 9, when she would be of age and have some command of money for generous schemes. And also those opening pages look at her and her sister's statuses as heiresses with £700 a year each. And they point to the subsequent possibility of Dorothea having a son who would inherit Mr. Brooke's estate, presumably worth about £3,000 a year. So she is defined in the opening portrait as a woman of wealth and as a woman whose son will have the entail of her uncle's estate and inherit her uncle's estate. Dorothea would like to use her money in a socially responsible way, and the money is a way of elevating Dorothea to a kind of status as a modern saint. I say as a modern saint because it is through money and through giving money that she is consecrated, that she is seen as saintly. Her deeds are performed through money, and this money gives her the agency to bring about almost miracles or close to miracles in helping other people. Her financial schemes are not always considered viable, and at the beginning, Chetham, who is courting her, condones them, although he realizes that they are not going to be money spinners. As he says on page 69, of course, investing in her schemes would be sinking money, he says, and that is why people object to it. Laborers can never pay rent to make it answer, but after all, it is worthwhile. It's worth doing because it will bring about social improvement. So Dorothy is motivated by a wish to do something good with her money, something which will make other people's lives better to them. It's quotation 14 on the sheet that I set out for you. She knows that she can help not only the laborers on her uncle's estate, but as the plot unfolds, she proposes to help with the building of the fever hospital, which Lydgate is involved in. As she says to him in chapter 44, I feel sure I can help a little. I have some money and I don't know what to do with it. And that is often an uncomfortable thought to me. But at that stage, she is still married, and so she is obliged to ask her husband for his approval of spending her money the way she would like to, helping the fever hospital, which she does, and he does with a little bit of reluctance, but he does agree to this particular scheme. She indeed does understand political economy, unlike her uncle's denial on page 16. Her uncle's reference to his own reading of Adam Smith, the author of The Wealth of the Nations, published in the 18th century, tells more about her uncle than it does about her, because we know that Adam Smith's economic treatise is one of laissez-faire economics, more in keeping with Mr. Brooks' attitude to social issues than his niece's more responsible and generous attitude to try and better what is called at the end of the novel, on page 784, an imperfect social state. At the end of the novel, as we know, Dorothea's sainthood is consecrated almost by her decision to renounce material comfort and possession in order to have freedom to live the life she chooses for herself. In other words, marrying Will Ladislaw. And that outburst, when she expresses herself on page 762, reads, I don't mind about poverty. I hate my wealth. She says to Will, we could live quite well on my own fortune. It is too much, 700 a year. I want so little, no new clothes, and I will learn what everything costs. So money defines the character of Dorothea and of the other women of the text. It also is defining in the male characters, of course. We've already seen the miser and the swindler. We can look at the clergyman, Mr. Fairbrother, who we actually know plays billiards for money, which makes his character perhaps more complex, as it gives it a human side. It might shock Lydgate that he plays billiards for money, but it does give humanity to Mr. Fairbrother. Money shows the offhand, perhaps somewhat irresponsible attitude of Lydgate, as we are told that he had no power for imagining the part which the want of money plays in determining the actions of some men, and his inability to imagine what a lack of money how that would affect people, shows perhaps, as I said, a certain lack of responsibility for him, and maybe even calls into question his ability to be a good practitioner as a doctor. He might be a good researcher, but not necessarily good at identifying how people function. We are told that it was his first impulse was always to be liberal with half-crowns as matters of no importance to a gentleman, and it never occurred to him to devise a plan for getting half-crowns. So he was never concerned with how he was actually going to earn money, how he was going to obtain those half-crowns necessary for actually living. So perhaps his being superior to the issues of money spells his downfall and his share of the responsibility of the domestic bankruptcy. Money brings out the true colors of the well-named Will, his will to be a self-made man and not to depend on his cousin, Mr. Casaubon. He protests that he wants to earn his own living and rely on his innate capital, his capital being his brain and his wit. As he says to Dorothea, Mr. Casaubon's generosity has perhaps been dangerous to me, and I mean to renounce the liberty it has given me. I mean to go back to England shortly and work my own way, depend on nobody else than myself. He wants to be an independent man, and indeed, as we know, he succeeds as an independent man. Joshua Rigg is defined by money in the sense that his ambition is to have a money changer's shop. He is the love child of Mr. Featherstone, as we know. He inherits Mr. Featherstone's money, but also Mr. Featherstone's passion for money. And the passage that I have given you from page 488, I won't read it out here, but I've highlighted the key phrases in it, shows you that for Joshua Rigg, money is a driving passion, which is presented almost in sensuous terms, as my colleague Michael Hollington wrote in a quotation from his book on Middlemarch, published by Atland this year, when he writes of that description of Joshua Rigg, that these powerful lines mix the language of sexual desire with the language of money lust, the allegorical figure of cupidity punning on Cupid, the idea of money also breeding coins, so that there's a sense of fertility through this sensuous relationship to money, which defines the character of Joshua Rigg. Coming back to Lydgate, and the passage quoted earlier, that in that passage we learn that money had never been a motive to him, which I'm going to take here as a preterition, a denial, and indeed as a transition to my second part, which is that money is actually a driving force in this narrative, and it is the motive which pushes the plot, forward. It's the money is at the heart of this it's at the heart of the relationships defining the community, relationships which intersect, creating a complex financial web. We have that image again of the web, with money being the various threads which tie the various characters together. It is a motivating force in the relationships, structuring force, but also a disruptive force, a force which has sexual drive to it, as we saw in the case of Joshua Rigg, and in a very understated way in how the narrator presents the marital dispute between Dorothea and Edward Casaubon, because the question of money and Dorothea's plea that she wants to restore his fair share to Ladislaw, that ignites Casaubon's jealousy. It exacerbates the tension in the marriage, as we see in the 20th quotation I've given you. Dorothea's outpouring of her notions about money in the darkness of the night had done nothing but bring a mixture of more odious foreboding into her husband's mind. And so their sexual energy, which should be expressed in the darkness of the night, is expressed in this dispute that they have about how to reallocate their wealth, their property, giving Ladislaw his fair share, and Dorothea's notions of justice only ignite, as I said, her husband's jealousy, which of course will be translated in the codicil, which he adds to his will. So money, as I said, is a structuring force in the narrative, driving the plot forward. The money is used to show how the characters can move from one social position to another. The word living, as you know, is used to mean a clerical position. Having a living is having a position as a vicar or a priest in a church, and the appointment to the living on page 478 is one of the strands of the plot, as is, of course, the appointment of the clergy man who is going to be associated with the hospital. So the word to earn a living is one of the driving forces of the plot. Money also motivates the characters' movements, as we are told on page 752. Will Ladislaw returns to Middlemarch at the end of the narrative. The narrator says, quite irrespective of Dorothea, not with the objective of coming to see Dorothea again, but because he wants to ask Mr. Bulstrode for some money to invest in a scheme in the far west. So it's money which drives Will back to Middlemarch ostensibly, and of course that ends up with the Will and Dorothea meeting again, and of course finally with their marriage. Now, the dynamics of the relationships, which are played out through debts, through loans, through the codicil, which I just mentioned, of course, through wills more generally, in the political economy of this novel. Those exchanges are, of course, defined and codified no more so than in the wills. And as I said in the introduction, in the patriarchal society that the Victorian society was, it was men who controlled the inheritance, and the women were dispossessed when they married. In the mid 19th century, a commission was set up on the notion of mort main, those are the two French words, which of course give the title to Book 5, The Dead Hand, a metonymy for the will of the patriarch. And the image of Featherstone, the dead Featherstone, his corpse, with his dead hand on his pile of gold, embodies that image of the control that the patriarch had over his property after his death. That image is on page 299, the 23rd quote of this presentation. In the same way, Casaubon, of course, as tester, has control over his widow because he puts a condition on the access to his wealth. That condition is that Will not become her husband. So the transactions, financial transactions, are exemplified by the will, which binds the characters. The relationships are also energized and move on through other forms of financial exchange. I mentioned debt. There's, of course, also bankruptcy. On one end of the spectrum, there's gambling, also philanthropy, investing in good social causes, and other financial transactions resulting in relationships of indebtedness through bribery or through blackmail as well. So we can see money as an energizing force. We can see it as an energizing positive force through growth. And that we can see, for example, how the characters in the chapter Waiting for Death they are anticipating an inheritance. There's a future dimension that there might be some inheritance which will bring about growth, which will bring about expansion. And on page 89, we are told, this is the 24th quote, that one of the reasons that Mr. Vinci married his wife was that there was a cheering sense of money. He was looking forward to a brighter future. Mr. Featherstone himself refers to wealth as something which can grow, as something which can be warm and which can bring life. One of his maxims, which is repeated in the novel, is that money is a good egg, and if you've got money, you should leave it behind you, but you should lay it in a warm nest. The idea being that money will hatch if it's put into a warm, organic environment where it will grow. Significantly, in the context of in the social context of change in the novel, the railway is presented not only as the growth of communication, but also as growth in the economy. In chapter 56, the narrator says, yes, business breeds, so it brings about fertile growth. And one form of business which was beginning to breed just then was the construction of the railways. But of course, that construction brings about not only growth for those who can invest in it, but also a downfall for the poorer spectrum of on the social scale. These railways, which are radically going to transform the British landscape by further connecting far-off places, that construction is fueled by money, of course, bringing about expansion for those, as I said, who can invest, but a worsening, an aggravation of social inequality, as the quote a few pages later, expressed by the workers, indicates on page 526. The railways might be good for the big folks to make money out on, but they'll only leave the poor man further behind. Sorry, I can't imitate the countryman's accent there. So money can be a source of growth. It can also be associated with destruction, and can even indeed have a deadly effect. It's significant that the moment when Bulstrode is exposed to the community at the meeting he attends is a meeting to set up a subscription to buy a plot for use as a burial ground. I'm pointing to the passage on page on page 682, so that his downfall, the loss of his public reputation takes place at a time when the community is trying to invest in a cemetery, in a burial ground. So it's bringing about his figurative death, but also there's a hint of physical death as well. Money brings about downfall and shows a negative side of humanity. We see men metamorphosed into vultures, reduced to animals around the death of Mr. Featherstone at the time of his burial. For example, their grasping greediness merits their comparison to Christian carnivora on page 310. And when Lydgate is driven to go to the Green Dragon, that place of temptation, as it's called on page 629, his engaging in gambling there, playing billiards, also metamorphoses him into an animal where he's described as having fierce eyes and retractile claws. So money brings about the bestial in men. This shows us how this shows us how characters change through money. It's a force in them, which could be a force for good and for growth and for philanthropy, but can also be a force for destruction and for degradation. This sense of energy associated with money is celebrated in chapter 60 when the larchers put up their possessions for auction. And this is because the larchers have earned a great deal of money. They have purchased a superior house, which is already furnished, and they want to sell off all of their possessions to have a new start in their higher position in life. On page 565, this auction is presented as a festival, as what is called a fair. It's a celebration, almost like a wedding, with food and drink, and associated with this fair is also the auctioneer, Mr. Trumbull, who is there making money on this auction. We're told that it's not in that particular passage, it's earlier. We're told that auctioneers will talk wild and no one but Mr. Trumbull has made money. How Mr. Trumbull has made money through this festivity of the auctioning, and his auctioneer practice is one of rhetoric. It's associated with a playfulness of language, as we can see on page 569, where we're given a sample of one of his riddles, which is, "How must you spell honey to make it catch ladybirds?" The answer is money. You hear? Ladybirds, honey, money. This is an amusement to sharpen the intellect. It has a sting. It is what we call satire and wit without indecency. So money is here rhyming with honey and giving a rhetorical sort of play to this activity of selling off the possessions. So it's a community action at the fair with the money. That association with money is one that we will come back to when we look at money as a semiotic system, of course. But I wanted to make the point that the community at this is buying and we're selling off the larcher's possessions in a kind of festival of money, in a community action, a social gathering. So there's a sense of money circulating there. Money circulating is performed when Mr. Featherstone hands 5 banknotes to Fred, and those banknotes, 4 of which then circulate again when Fred gives them to his mother. And this notion of circulation, playing into one of the structuring metaphors of our novel, is spelt out when the narrator is talking about Lydgate's debts. I'm now on quotation 32, which are described as miserably sordid. He's in miserably sordid troubles with a degrading preoccupation for money, And the narrator draws on the word dribbling, the verb dribbling, of water dripping down, and also how the money that he has received is then absorbed, which is also a metaphor associated with liquidity, absorbing, and how he is unable to negotiate his debts, and that is because not enough money is dribbling in, sorry, and that is described in terms of related to liquid there, so to circulation and to the flow of money. So circulation being one of the structuring metaphors of this novel. Another, which already referred to in this presentation, is of course that of the web and how the characters are tied together through money, through debts, as I said, to one another. And here the word obliged, from the verb to be obliged to someone, is significant because the verb obliged comes from the Latin ligare, which means to bind or to tie to, and is used to mean to make lands or property or possessions a guarantee or a security on a loan. And what you can also use the verb to oblige to mean to pawn or to mortgage something. So therefore, when the characters say to each other that they are much obliged to them, in a figurative sense, that they're much indebted to, for example, when Featherstone gives Fred that money, that is meaning that they are figuratively indebted to, but also there's this hint that that the links of the web are becoming stricter and more punitive. That lending of the money, or giving of the money, I should say, because Featherstone gives Fred the money, initiates a kind of monetary entanglement and indebtedness, which will recur as a structuring pattern throughout the novel, of course. And they are linked in this inextricable change of obligation of one character to another. So Fred to Mr. Featherstone, but of course that's echoed by Lydgate when he says to Mr. Bulstrode on page 664, I'm deeply indebted to you, I'm deeply indebted to you, and he feels under very strong personal obligation to Mr. Bulstrode. Mr. Bulstrode, who advises Mr. Lydgate on page 643, quotation 35, to that instead of involving himself further in further obligations, instead of taking out further debts, to declare himself bankrupt, and therefore Mr. Bulstrode could help him, and he would make him even more indebted. So we have there the use of the word obligation. Don't get yourself involved in further obligation. Don't get yourself involved in further debt, which Lydgate, of course, realizes, but realizes only later, that was creating in him that strong sense of personal obligation, which I quoted just a few minutes ago. It's a quotation from page 662. Lydgate realizes and articulates to himself on page 695 that Bulstrode's true motives when he says what he wanted was to bind me to him by a strong obligation. That was why he passed on from a sudden hardness to liberality. And that was a fettering of him, and that word is used by in relation to it's Dorothea who uses that word in relation to what Lydgate is suffering. He is suffering from a fettering want of income. He's enchained by a lack of income, by a lack of money. It's a kind of yoke on him. We've seen that word yoke used in this novel. He's chained by this lack of money, caught in the caught in the web. And so she has found a plan which will free him from that uh, um, from that. It's a plan which she sets out in chapter 70, in chapter 76, a way that she will be able to provide money for him. But let's that's sorry, yes, that's it's set out in chapter 76, and more explicitly on page 724, this 37th quotation. And here, she has this plan to free Lydgate of his obligation to Mr. Bulstrode, and she wrote that in a little note, which was very brief, but it had all of the efficiency of a written statement. It had the power to erase that chain of debts which he was involved in. And the narrator writes very significantly, and I'm quoting here from the 37th quote, she pleaded that she had more claim than Mr. Bulstrode had to the satisfaction of providing the money which had been serviceable to Lydgate. And I would like to underscore the use of the verb to provide there. To provide the money, she's going to give the money. She has the agency to give the money, but also the etymology of that verb is significant because it comes to mean to provide, to give to, and it's the same etymology as the word providence. It's almost, again, associating Dorothea with the religious, with this charitable action that she is making to erase the blackmail, bribery, which Lydgate seemed to have become engaged in, and to pull him, to free him from his chains. She has written that note to free him from his chains. It's a written note which Bulstrode receives, and which we're told cut Mrs. Bulstrode, because it showed Mrs. Bulstrode that her husband was lost, that he could no longer help. And it is a written note which gives all of the power to language as the engagement of the money. It's like a promissory note that she has written, a check, if you like, so that money is represented there through language, because she writes this note to say she's going to help Lydgate. She's also going, of course, going to write a check. And this is coming back to, coming to money as a representational system. And we saw that the auctioneer was a man transacting money, but a man who was also a man of rhetoric, a man of words. And Caleb Garth, whom we saw was indifferent to money matters at the beginning, for him, we're told on page 317, words were the hardest part of business. So one of the reasons he isn't successful in financial transactions, he has other values, is that he finds words hard. So as I said, this brings me to my third part, which is money as a semiotic system. Of course, I'm very aware that this is a much longer presentation than you would do if this were a leçon for you, but I'm trying to give you as many pointers as I can on this subject. So, running over time, money as a semiotic system. It is part of a semiotic code. It's a symbol, if you like, and indeed there are many elements of language which relate to both the financial sphere and the literary sphere. So money is used as a metaphor, explicitly so, to describe Mr. Casaubon. We know that he vehicles frigid rhetoric, as the narrator says on page 46. I'm down to quotation 39 here. And Mr. Casaubon, who is reflecting on what marriage would mean to him, he does so in a metaphor expressed in financial terms, almost as if his marriage is going to be like opening a bank account or using his bank account. The narrator writes, poor Mr. Casaubon had imagined that his long studious bachelorhood had stored up for him a compound interest of enjoyment, and that large drafts of his affections would not fail to be honored. For we, all of us, grave or light, get our thoughts entangled in metaphors and act fatally on the strength of him. So that in that key quotation about metaphors and how we act on the strength of metaphors, which has been extracted and used in relation to the language of Middlemarch, was actually first of all related to the financial metaphor. So as I said, there are numerous words which belong to both the financial sphere and to the literary sphere. To begin with, of course, the verb to tell, as in to tell a story, to relate a story, also means to count. Think of a bank teller. A bank teller is one who counts money, and that was, in fact, the original meaning of the word to tell, to mention something numerically, to count it out. The verb to retail means to tell again, to recount, but of course also to sell by in small quantities, to be sold by retail. You say in French détailler, so to divide and to sell in small quantities. And we're told that Mr. Momsey, the grocer of Middlemarch, we're told, this is quotation 40, the second quotation in that group of quotations, he was a chief representative in Middlemarch of that great social power, the retail trader. He actually punctuates his speech with money because he rattles the coins in his pocket, we're told, on page 470. And for him, the importance of any political change is the effect that it will have financially for him, the effects on his till and ledger, as he says on page 470. So to retail is related to both the sphere of language and the sphere of money and the retail trade. The Vincies themselves trade in gossip, another determining circulatory system in this novel, as brilliantly analyzed by Gillian Beer in her article on gossip and systems of circulation. And we're told on page 90 that there was no report about Lydgate which was not retailed at the Vincies, where visitors were frequently were frequent. So their gossip is retailed and told again. Another verb relating to both the financial and the literary sphere is the verb to utter, because to utter actually means to bring goods to a market for sale. So utterance has a trading meaning. And we can see this in the quotation that I've spelled out for you there from chapter 62, when Ladislaw and Dorothea are pictured at a loss for words, because they are both have in their minds the safeguard of wealth, which was inherent in Casaubon's deathly codicil forbidding any financial exchange for them. This is a point which is made by Marie-Laure Massay-Chamaillou when she makes this quotation, which she pinpoints this important quotation from chapter 62. What could he say, since what had got obstinately uppermost in his mind was the passionate love for her which he forbade himself to utter? And what could she say, since she might offer him no help, since she was forced to keep the money that ought to have been his. And there I want to stress that use of the verb to utter. He could not utter his love for her, meaning he could not engage in his love. He could not trade in that love. He could not bring his goods for sale, as it were, in a symbolic way, because the codicil forbade any transaction, any intimate transaction between them, or any close transaction, indeed, between them. Other elements of the lexicon which participate in both the financial and the literary. I haven't got precise examples for them, but we can think how to credit someone is used in both spheres, and we can say that Dorothea gives Lydgate credit. She believes what he says. She secures his reputation. She has a kind of confidence in what he says, just as a buyer will have confidence. Someone who lends money will have confidence in the person to whom they lend it, that they will pay it back in the future. So Dorothea credits Lydgate by giving him money, and she signals that she believes his story through her financial backing, and that she will assure that his actions are not condemned by others. She insists others will believe me. There are also symbolic debts in the novel, as Fred explains to Mr. Garth in chapter 56. I have already a debt to you which will never be discharged, even when I have been able to pay it back in the shape of money. So there are emotional debts as well as financial debts. As Bulstrode recognizes in the reflections that we get mediated through the narrator in chapter 61, Raffles had made it evident that his eagerness to torment was almost as strong in him as any other greed. He had certainly a few debts more to pay than he expected. So Bulstrode realizes that money alone will not be enough to free him of Raffles. He has more of a debt to Raffles than just a financial one. The word business is also used both as a financial transaction, but also more generally as any transactions between people. And book 1 ends with a reference to the unpleasant business. And that unpleasant business is that of the disclosure of Fred's debt. He has a debt which needs to be paid off, and that unpleasant business is both a financial one, but also one involving various members of the community and how it will all unfold, with finally Featherstone giving Fred some money, the money that Fred had counted on in his inheritance, but only a small portion of it, of course. Coming back to the Bulstrode-Raffles relationship, business there is used as a trope for blackmail. When Bulstrode says to Raffles, "Now tell me, you said that you had wished to see me, and you probably considered that you had some business to transact with me." And there, of course, the use of the word business is one of blackmail, as I suggested. So money is used as a representational system. It's related to the system of language, where words are used both literally as literal transactions, but also as symbolic and figurative ones. And that sense of a representational system brings us to the notion of a symbol, and a symbol which can have various meanings and various interpretations. And you'll remember that key quotation about how there are small signs which can have unlimited interpretations, and the importance of the hermeneutics and how you interpret what those signs are. So money is an ambivalent, money can be an ambivalent value. It can be constructive. It can help to buy land. It can help to build, like building a hospital. It can help to educate, as the Garths want to educate their children. Mrs. Garth is putting money aside to do so. But it can also be destructive, as we've seen, and associated with death. On a moral level, money can therefore bring consecration, as in the case of Dorothea, which I've stressed, brings her a sense of helping, of charity, and elevates her to the status of a modern-day saint, as I said. But money can also be a corrupting influence. As Lydgate says, I don't see that there's any money getting without chance. So that there must be a sense of gambling or of chance, no matter what the money getting is. And he even says, even a profession can be associated with chance. His own debts are referred to as being sordid, so sordid, degraded, corrupt, beneath the attention of lofty people. And I've given you that quotation. Again, I won't read out the entire quotation from chapter 64, the 48th quotation, where there's a sense of money being associated with immorality and corruption, associated with the horse dealer, that figure who actually punctuates our entire novel, because at the beginning of the novel, you remember, Fred tries to pay off his debt, dealing in the selling and buying of a horse unsuccessfully. Here we have the horse dealer again. And in the concluding chapter of the novel, which I'm referring you to, please look at it again. Fred still buys and sells horses. We're told not successfully, but his wife Mary generously excuses him and forgives him, saying that the problem wasn't with Fred, but with the horses themselves. That the horses themselves weren't of value. So we can see this horse dealing as another of the manifestations of the different forms of financial transaction in the novel. And here I'm associating it with the sense of immorality, which and dishonest financial transactions, earning money dishonestly or not totally above board, as in gambling, which is practiced in the Green Dragon, as you know, and which is referred to in the 66th chapter as an easy way of getting money. So it's not the Victorian work ethic of earning money earnestly, and the importance of having a job for the Victorian community. Here it's gambling, which is an easy way of getting money. Now, that easy way of getting money was, of course, how Bulstrode earned his money, and I've given you some of the quotations about that in the 50th group of quotations. There, it is Mrs. Dollop who puts her finger on it, saying that Bulstrode got all of his money, which he brought into this town, by thieving and swindling. He got all of his money by thieving and swindling. He made his money, as I said earlier, through the pawn broking business. But even though the money has been earned in that dishonest way, it's money, and therefore it has a value to it. As Mr. Limp says, it would be a bad thing for the town if his money went out of it. So no matter how it's been earned, can be used in a constructive way. And the firm-voiced Dyer responds on page 678 by saying, yes, he says, yes, there are better folks who spend their money worse. So Mr. Bulstrode is investing this ill-got money in a positive way, in a constructive way. We're told, so that money is ambivalent. It's a representational system which has multi-values to it. It is ambivalent, different valencies to it. Because the money that Bulstrode had was brought to the town by thieving and swindling, Lydgate recognizes that when he was given money by Bulstrode, the money was a type of bribe, as you can see in the 60th quotation I've given you there. And that money, therefore, is tainted. It is money which means that Lydgate is now blighted, as he himself said. Will similarly wants to resist getting that money, and as he says, I don't want to keep your ill-gotten money. He does not want to be associated with Bulstrode's financial dishonesty. Now, an example how dirty money circulates and benefits not necessarily the most deserving is seen in that circulation of Bulstrode's money, and this circulation shows the ambivalent value of money. He himself was beneficiary of an illegitimate, dishonest inheritance. Illegitimate and dishonest because, of course, it was covered up. He deliberately did not reveal that he'd found the true, the person who should have inherited the money, namely Will's mother. And Bulstrode's inheriting the money had for consequence that Will did not inherit what he deserved, what he rightfully deserved. And to try and make amends for that, Bulstrode offers the money to Will, who, as we have seen, doesn't want to have anything to do with this ill-gotten money. And so finally, Bulstrode tries to make amends by granting the money to his wife's relatives. He tries to give the money to Lydgate, so who is one of his wife's relatives through marriage, through marriage to Rosamond Vincy, but Lydgate has virtually rejected any further service for him, and so he will not accept the money. Therefore, Bulstrode gives the money, or enables Fred Vincy to benefit from the money by establishing him in a sociably respectable position, managing Stone Court. Stone Court, which Mr. Bulstrode has purchased. It was the home of Featherstone, and Mr. Bulstrode's purchase of it is another instance of how money has circulated. It has circulated from Featherstone to his love child who loves money, Joshua Rigg, and Joshua Rigg, who then sells it to Bulstrode in a circulation which is highly ironic, because Featherstone, the last person Featherstone would have wanted to live in Stone Court and to inherit and to possess it would have been Mr. Bulstrode, his arch enemy. Or at least they didn't get on well. Perhaps it's an overstatement to say he was an arch enemy. So in any case, the rather feckless, irresponsible Fred, who suffers from debt throughout the narrative, ends up benefiting from Mr. Bulstrode's dirty money by managing Stone Court. So that's an example of the circulation of money and how money can have the ambivalent values. It brings about good in the sense that it allows the marriage of Fred and Mary Garth. So to conclude on the importance of money, or the function of money, and how it plays out in this narrative, I want to come back to that brief note that Dorothea wrote, freeing Lydgate of his debt to Bulstrode. It was a very brief note which had an enormous impact, but as you will remember, the narrator questions at what point, who shall tell what may be the effect of money? Sorry, of writing. Who shall tell what may be the effect of writing? And here, of course, the writing has an enormous impact. It's a representational system which frees Lydgate and brings independence. And that is that sense of the written comes back to the change of the monetary system in the Victorian period, which the narrator had pictured with the image of the stocking, where people would save money, giving way to the savings bank, and in a more concrete way, the gold coin is replaced by paper, by checks, by paper, which records banknotes, which record what money is represented. Banknotes, which are a symbolic representation of money. And Lydgate, whom we've seen has a certain irresponsible attitude towards money. We're told on page 135, in a parallel between his considering the circulation of the blood, we're told he had no more thought of how his blood circulated than how paper served instead of gold. So the circulation of blood there is paralleled in the analogy of gold circulating through banknotes, which are a symbolic representation of that money. A symbolic representation which puts to question what is being represented, in the same way that this novel in key moments questions language. In a key quotation, when Dorothea, having written the note freeing Lydgate, reflects she doesn't mind what he calls her. She doesn't mind what name she's given, what word is given to it, as long as the transaction can take place. And that quotation is on page 724. He might call her a creditor, or by any other name, if it did but imply that he granted her request. Sorry that I'm tripping over that quotation. But the importance there is that she doesn't mind what he calls her in this transaction, in this financial transaction. She doesn't mind the value of language. It's not the actual word that counts, it's the action that counts. Just as there is a distinction between the symbol of language and what it actually, and it's the value that it actually represents. And that's where this novel and the sort of moral of this novel, if there is, or the message of this novel, is that there is more value than just a financial countable novel, as Mary Garth articulates when she says goodbye to Fred after the reading of Featherstone's will, realizing that she has to a certain extent deprived him of his inheritance by not playing with Featherstone's by not granting Featherstone's request to burn the second will. She says, I do believe you are better without the money. What was the good of it to Mr. Featherstone? And that was on page 319. So it's money. What's the value of money? What is important, she seems to be saying, is, of course, life. Because what good was it to Mr. Featherstone? He died. Lydgate himself accepts Dorothea's generosity, saying to himself that Dorothea's love might help a man more than her money, so that what has more value there is love rather than money. And Will himself reaches that conclusion when, again, through the narrator's mediation on page 588, he thinks, or he harbors the secret hope that after some years he might come back with the sense that he had at least a personal value equal to her wealth. And that now seemed to be a dreamy continuation of a dream, but that his own personal value will be equal to her wealth. In other words, it won't matter what a bank account is. What matters is the human qualities. And Eliot makes that point, or suggests that point in the very conclusion of our novel, where we are told that Dorothea's nature has been spent in channels. It has been spent. The energy has been depleted, but that verb spend is also a financial verb, of course. And we're then told that the effect of her being was incalculably diffuse. You couldn't count what the effect was because it was incalculable. It was not able to be valued in financial terms. But of course, as we're told in the conclusion, it was the greatest of impacts. So therefore, the message which Eliot seems to spell out in this novel is one of value, and trying to evaluate what value means. A narrative in which we could say that an umbrella ring, which was the binding force between Mary and Fred, of course, for them had symbolic value, that an umbrella ring has more value than all of the jewels inherited from Mrs. Brooke, and which the two Brooke sisters divide. I hope that's been of help to you in considering and reflecting on the question of money in Middlemarch, a very, very central question, of course. All the best.